Hi everybody, good afternoon and welcome to this week's ISE webinar. Really pleased to be joined by Helen Liddle today from SRS, and also Tristram Hooley, our Chief Research Officer. I'll hand over to both of them very shortly, and they'll get stuck into the core of the content. Just a reminder about how our webinars work if you are new to them, although I think after a good sort of year and a half, I think most people know the drill. Please use the platform to ask any questions. You'll see there's a questions box, so anything that you want to ask Helen or Tristram as we go through the session, pop them in there. I will come back on at the end after Helen and Tristram have gone through all the really interesting key information and data that they're going to be talking to us about, the research that they've done. Yeah, and I'll pose any questions to the two of them. We record all our webinars, and the webinar will come back out to you on a link probably later today, maybe tomorrow. So feel free to use that link to go and recap anything that you want to catch on that you may have missed, or share it amongst your team. We're really keen for all all the knowledge and insights that we have to get out to as many people as possible. Yep, so please feel free to share that link. That's enough from me. Remember to put your questions in as we go along. Helen, shall I hand over to you first, and then you want to take it from here?
Yeah. Brilliant. Thanks very much, Stephen. Welcome to our Skills for Success webinar. So pleased to see so many of you joining us, which is fantastic. Just to introduce myself, I am Helen Liddle, and I'm the University Partnerships Manager for SRS Recruitment and Employability Experts. And we work with a number of graduate employers to design and deliver their recruitment process. We then feed this knowledge into the work that we do with universities through webinars, workshops, practical exercises, and our award-winning assessment centre simulations, all aimed at helping students and graduates secure those all-important placements and graduate roles. Really proud to be a supply partner of the ISE, and really pleased to have collaborated with them on this particular research project, looking at people's understanding of what skills are most important to demonstrate to employers. So just to give you a bit of background, so there's so much talk, well, there has been and there continues to be so much discussion around skills gaps, the skills agenda and the skills for jobs. And there's general agreement that the development of skills is, of course, very important for driving growth in the economy. It's essential for people entering the labour market and maintaining their employability. But what people don't tend to agree on as much is which of these skills are most important, and also how best to demonstrate and develop these. And of course, this is going to vary depending on the type of role and the type of industry and sector, but we really wanted to establish some common ground. And at SRS, we began by asking our student following what skills they wanted our support with. And we actually created a free webinar series based upon this, kind of honing in on 8 skills that students wanted extra support with in a post-COVID workforce. We also delved into the ISE research, in particular the Student Development Survey, where we were able to see the key skills required by their employer members. And the ISE had broadly broken this down into technical skills, workplace skills, transferable skills, and attributes and behaviours. And we wanted to build on this and really drill down to what was important, and to give a particular focus on those soft skills and behaviours that apply across multiple industries and roles. Rather than looking at the employer perspective and the student perspective in isolation, we wanted to provide a direct comparison between them and to include universities and suppliers in this as well. Do students have a good understanding of the skills that are most important to employers? And are universities and suppliers supporting students with the areas that they most want to develop? These are the type of questions that we wanted to address. And I'm just going to hand over to Tristram to give you some further background there. Are you there, Tristram?
Sorry, mute. Always fun, isn't it? Yes, if you're here, you probably already know plenty about the ISE. I'm just going to emphasise a couple of things that might be worth you having a look at. So we've got our Knowledge Hub, which is where we put all of the reports and so on. So the report that we're going to do, which is this research is based on that we're presenting today will appear there hopefully later this afternoon or early tomorrow morning. And so we've been doing a lot of polling and so on recently, so we've got quite a lot of reports, but also all of our big research reports, the recruitment survey, the development survey, and so on are all there. And we'd really like to just draw your attention to, in case you've missed it, the complete guide to student recruitment and development, which we launched at conference a couple of weeks ago, and which we're really, really proud of. And I think it is our attempt to draw together all of the knowledge in the ISE network into a kind of handy to access guide. So if you're an ISE member, your organisation should have been sent at least a copy of that, but you'll be able to access it online. Obviously, if you want to buy more copies, then you can do that as well. If you're not an ISE member, then, well, why don't you become one? But also, you can buy the complete guide to student recruitment and development as well. So if we move on now. So we've been doing these monthly polls each month since April, and they've really been working very, very well. So what we're trying to do is just send out a very small number of questions, often in partnership with somebody else, and just find out what the ISE membership is thinking about some things. And we've also got some questions which I'll present at the end here, which look at sort of overall confidence in the student employment market. So we'll get to that in a second. So if we move on. So this was our June poll. We sent out to all the ISE membership, and we've had a really good response. You'll see all of the number of people who are answered each of the questions, but we've got both employers responding to it. I've broken those down into sectors, and then we've got education providers and suppliers. The suppliers are all the people who sit in between, including, of course, SRS themselves. So we went out to our whole membership and said, what do you think about some of these things? Now, some of the questions we just asked to employers, some to the whole membership, and we'll kind of get onto that as we go through. Go on to the next one. We then produced, SRS organised a survey which they sent out to current students and graduates, including some postgraduates as well. And we got good response from those as well. So we've got hundreds of responses there that we've analysed alongside the employer and ISE member data. So if we go on to the next one. So what we looked at, the core focus of this is looking at skills and how employers, what skills people think are important, and how employers actually go about measuring and assessing those skills in the recruitment process. And we focused on, we drew out of the development survey essentially the top 10 skills, and then we took out of that some of the ones that were more technical, because we thought this piece of work was more focused on sort of transferable employability skills, that sort of thing. And then we added in a couple that SRS have been working on, which they thought would be really important, and actually have proved to be very, very important as well. So learning agility, and what's the other one that we added in?
Problem solving. Problem
solving, yes. So and I think they will definitely find their way into future ISE general surveys, because, well, as you'll see, they're ones that people are very, very interested in. So if we go on. And sorry, was I doing this one, Helen?
Yes, that's okay, Tristram.
Oh, okay, very good. Right, so one of the things we asked students was how they were developing these skills. So what approach were they taking to develop these skills, generally while they're at university? And we can see that actually there's the interest in developing skills through part-time work was really, really strong. There was an article in Wonky last week where people, I think it was Jim Dickinson, was talking about the need to rethink the role that part-time work has in the student experience. And because lots and lots of students work part-time, in the past that was often seen as a kind of distraction from their studies. But in fact, what we found here is that many students perceive that part-time work not just as a way of kind of, you know, buying some beer or whatever, or paying their rent, but also as part of their career journey, as part of developing their skills and so on. And then we find a whole load of other things that you might perhaps more typically expect. So all very experiential things. So you know, running clubs, getting involved with charity, that sort of thing. So students are definitely engaging with these things, and they're taking action while they're at university to try and do something about it. Very, very few are answering that they're doing nothing. So it's less than 10% of students are saying, oh, actually, I'm not bothering to develop my skills at all. So students are fixated on it. That raises a question of what it is they're actually fixated on.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tristram. Okay, so one of the questions that we asked employers, educators and suppliers, and students and graduates was what they perceive to be the 3 most important skills to demonstrate in the recruitment process. So they had those 12 areas to choose from. And you can see some high-level results here. And they've all agreed overwhelmingly that problem solving is the most important skill to show in that process. And you can also see some overlap there as well, particularly in terms of resilience and learning agility. Now this chart goes into a bit more detail and shows the proportion of each group that agreed with a particular skill being important in that recruitment process. And if we start by looking at the students and graduates' responses in particular, there's an overwhelming majority there, 69% have had problem solving as the top skill to demonstrate in that recruitment process. And although to a lesser extent, they also see learning agility as being really important as well, the same as employers. It features in their top 3 as well. But that's where they do start to diverge away from ISE members, because you can see that one of their top 3 skills is time management. And when we explored with some of the students and graduates what they meant by this, they talked about being able to show employers that they could meet deadlines, that they could organise their time productively. And they felt it was more important to show evidence of that than it was to show resilience and commercial awareness, for example. So I thought that was quite interesting. And also in terms of students and graduates' responses as well, they do seem to be a bit less concentrated than ISE members. So there's less clear majorities there, which could indicate a bit of uncertainty about their knowledge of what employers are actually looking for in that recruitment process. Now, for educators and suppliers, they do have commercial awareness as one of their top 3, with 49% of them selecting that. And although that hasn't quite made it into the top 3 for employers, there is broad alignment between ISE members about which of the skills are most important. And that's for me was really quite encouraging to see, because it shows that the advice that's being provided by career services, whether that's in schools, colleges or universities, it implies that that advice is going to be broadly aligned to the skills that employers are looking for. We then went on to ask ISE members which 3 skills they saw as being most important to develop. And for employers, this was probably more aimed at a development activity that they were running after having hired students and graduates to some of their core programs and training workshops. And you can see here they've chosen commercial awareness, problem solving, and resilience. And it's great to see the alignment actually between the skills that they think that are most important to show in the recruitment process and the skills that they subsequently then develop and therefore continue to highlight as being important even after the candidates have been hired. So there's that real consistency there, particularly around problem solving and resilience. For educators and suppliers, again, we asked them the same question around the 3 most important skills to develop in their students. And you can see they've chosen career management, self-awareness, and commercial awareness, which looks very different to the 3 skills that they've identified as being most important to show in the recruitment process. But admittedly, that's probably what you'd expect. Educators and suppliers are going to be focused on preparing their students to secure those roles and placements. So they're going to be focused on that self-awareness, on supporting them with career management. So not too many surprises there. So for students and graduates, we asked them the question of which 3 skills they saw as being most important to develop. And they've given some very different answers. So they've led with negotiating and influencing, career management, and dealing with conflict. And compared to what they perceived as being important to show in recruitment, you know, it's a very, very different picture. So thinking about negotiating and influencing, for example, only 9% of them thought that this was important to show in the recruitment process, but 48% of them want to develop this. And the skills that they're looking to develop seem to be very much based around those ones that are perhaps more role-based. They might perceive that they need more practice in a work-based environment, as opposed to perhaps some of the broader concepts like learning agility. And again, here we go into that bit more detail, where you can see the proportion of each group that has chosen each skill as being one of the top 3 important ones to develop. And there is some consensus there, although it hasn't made the top 3 for students and graduates, it's only just missed out. Broadly, all 3 groups see commercial awareness as being very important to develop. But from that point onwards, you know, there is a real mismatch between students and graduates and employers. And that might show us that actually what employers are recruiting graduates for is not the same as what students and graduates believe they're being recruited for. You know, there might be that gap in understanding there. There's also some patterns in terms of the employer data as well. They saw learning agility as being particularly important in the recruitment process, and also they were quite strong on things like emotional intelligence. But they don't develop these. They don't see them as being priorities to develop, and that could be because they view these skills as being more innate, you know, more difficult to teach and train. Similarly, things like negotiating and influencing and leadership, you know, employers are more likely to develop these than to spot them, to assess for them as part of the recruitment process. And it may be that they don't expect candidates to have these skills fully developed at the hiring stage, and they can see that they're in a better position to develop them once they're hired. And just wanted to give a bit of more visual and use some Venn diagrams to bring it to life a bit more for those 2 kind of key questions, and to show the overlap between the 3 groups, or the lack of overlap in some cases. So for the most important skills to demonstrate, you know, problem solving and learning agility is coming through loud and clear there, and problem solving also feeds through into being one of those important skills to develop. And then looking at the development side of things, you know, there is no agreement, there's no overall consensus between all 3 groups, although there is clearly some overlap between 2 of them. And we were just looking at some of the skills that were cropping up the most in those 2 areas, that were having those strong majorities, to kind of create a bit of a skills hierarchy of the 5 areas that are genuinely the most important to demonstrate and develop. And we've identified those as being problem solving and learning agility as being the 2 front runners. Backed up there by resilience, commercial awareness, and career management. Those are the 5 that we would kind of hone in on if we had to, based upon those survey and poll results. I'm going to hand you over to Tristram to keep looking at some of the other data.
Great. So we now know what skills everyone's interested in, and we've seen this sort of thing that there is a bit of a disconnect between what employers are looking for and really want to focus on, and what students often think they want to focus on. Actually, I think there's something quite encouraging in the fact that generally there's quite a lot of alignment between the kind of educators and suppliers and the employers, and generally we've got this sort of sense that that universities, schools, and so on, suppliers know what employers are looking for and are generally ordering things in a very similar way. So, and obviously there are reasons why there are differences there. They're not all just about kind of disconnects or people failing to understand. You know, there are things that you might want to focus on as a student that are not necessarily about performing well in a recruitment process. But you know, it's interesting to look at these different perspectives. But where all the rubber really hits the road for this is in recruitment processes. So I'm going to kind of focus in on the recruitment process and where these skills actually get assessed. So we looked at a whole load of different types of assessment. Again, we couldn't look at everything, but we tried to kind of present a sort of, you know, I think we've got about 13 or 14 here. So sort of a top list of things that employers say that they're interested in. We grouped a few things together. but also to try and make the distinction between the face-to-face and online stuff, because that's so important at the moment. So if we go on to the next slide, what we can see is if we look down these different approaches, we can see that there are different places in which employers test all of these things. And so, you know, if we look, let's look at the top one to start with. So career management is something that if we ask, where do you test that in your process? We can see that, you know, the biggest chunk are testing that issue of career management at interviews. So they're perhaps saying, you know, you know, where do you see yourself in 10 years, or whatever question people are using to kind of test that in interviews. But you've also got some who perhaps are asking for it to be included as part of a presentation. They're testing it in their assessment centres in some way, or perhaps asking for some information about that as part of the application. And so when we kind of work through this, we start to get a different pattern for each of these kind of main skills. We start to get a different pattern of where they're being tested and how they're being assessed. And you know, what's clear from this is that the most important, the key areas where all of these skills are tested and assessed is in the assessment centres and in interviews. That's probably the key point at which employers are making decisions about skills, but it does vary. So, for example, negotiating and influencing, you know, group exercises are a particularly important way to test that. I mean, unsurprisingly, if you're thinking about what you're actually doing in negotiating and influencing, you want to see people interact, you want to see how they get on, and so on. Similarly, in the leadership area, that's something that you're probably as interested in observing in some kind of group exercise as you are perhaps in asking someone to talk about it at interview. So it does vary, but in pretty much all cases, interviews and assessment centres are some of the most important ways in which people are trying to assess these things. So if we go on to the next one, we've then looked at where the different groups think that students need more support. And with employers, we've ranked this by the employers' answers, and you know, the darker the green, the more support people need, and the more red it is, the less support that they need. And what you can see is that generally there's a reasonable amount of agreement between the employers and the educators and suppliers. Again here, so assessment centres, application forms, psychometric tests, these are things that they think students need a lot of help in. Now, there's some interesting stuff here as well about what students value. So they think things like cover letters is something that they would like a lot of support in, and face-to-face interviews, and so on. And we kind of thought about, well, what does that mean? And I think there's probably a couple of things going on here. So one thing is that not all students are applying to ISE members for jobs. So some might be working with SMEs. And if we thought about the ways in which ISE members' recruitment processes have changed over the last few years, but actually how they sort of started to develop in that direction anyway, what you could say is that ISE members, large employers recruiting quite a lot of students, they've started down this road of sort of automating, including a lot of technology in it. They'd started down that well in advance of the pandemic, but the pandemic has certainly accelerated that. If you looked at SMEs and you know, even larger companies that don't recruit a lot of people in one go, you would probably see the pattern will be much different. So, you know, while for ISE members, cover letters and CVs are pretty unusual, but in the wider labour market, that's quite common. So on one level, this is about a different focus. So if students are looking at different kinds of employers, then they might well be focused on different kinds of things. But there's also, I think, an element that students may be working off of an assumption about how recruitment works that's not completely up to date. So they might be assuming that the way you get a job is you put in a you know, CV and a cover letter, and then you get invited to interview, and you know, turn up in a looking smarter than I look today, and you know, the employer makes a decision about whether you've got the job or not. And as we know, with the kind of ISE members recruitment process, recruitment is not organised like that at all. In fact, almost none of those features are important anymore. And even though interviews remain very important to ISE members, they're much more likely to be happening online, and they may not even be actually at the heart of people's processes anymore. So you may have online assessment centres, psychometric tests, doing a lot of the heavy lifting here. So I think there's definitely something here about the way in which students and graduates understand the recruitment process to work, and also that the need for them to understand that it might work differently for different parts of the labour market. So if we go on to the next one.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've then broken this down into the sort of top three. So and you can see that kind of message that I was talking about. So for students and graduates, it looks pretty straightforward: cover letters, face-to-face, and then face-to-face assessment centres. We look at the comparison for employers, the kind of three most important are assessment centres, application forms, and psychometric tests. So there's really nothing in common there, and I think it is for the reasons I've talked about, really. So if we move on to the next one. So where do students expect to get support with this? Well, they go to the University Careers Service. I mean, actually, this is a little bit surprising to me, not because obviously I love University Careers Services and think they're absolutely, central, but I've seen a lot of questionnaires like this, and often people tend to go to family and friends first, but actually students seem to have got the sense that if they want help with the recruitment process, then University Careers Service is one of the best places they can go. They're also asking family and friends. They'd love to hear from employers, of course. They might be going to their personal tutors or lecturers, which really emphasises the importance of universities making sure that those people are giving good advice. And then they're going to social media and online information and jobs boards and so on as well. So there's a range of input that students are looking for. On to the next one. And just to finish up, I talked at the beginning about the importance of confidence, and it's something that we've been experimenting with and trying to measure, and it is giving us some interesting results, and I think they do make sense. So I'll just briefly talk through. Essentially, every month we ask people 4 questions. So do you believe the economic crisis is over? Do you believe there's enough opportunity for young people? Do you believe the worst of the COVID, that's how we put it, the worst of the COVID pandemic is over? And do you believe that your organisation is growing? And a score of 2 here is strongly agree, a score of -2 is strongly disagree, and a score of 0 is meh, is neither agree nor disagree. And what you can see is that most of our members, most ISE members, are kind of in the middle on all of these questions. They're not really strongly either way, which, this is an average figure that we get across the whole thing, and that hasn't really changed. So people are pretty unsure about what the future's holding. They're not sure the way that the kind of economy is tracking. They're not absolutely sure that COVID's over. On balance, they believe their organisations are doing okay. On balance, they believe that COVID is over. On balance, they think that probably there aren't quite enough opportunities for young people, and probably the economic crisis is not over. But in general, in all of these, there's a lot of kind of people in the middle who aren't really sure. And so I think that tells us quite a bit about the way in which the student labour market is moving. Because on one level, we think that things are looking up and that people are hiring more than they did last year. But I think people's kind of confidence that this is a permanent and that we're on the up, I think is relatively in the middle and unsure. So we'll carry on reporting on this month on month. We'll see how it develops over the next few months. Hopefully we'll start to see it all trending up as we all start to believe that good times are back again. So right, okay, I think we're almost at the end of what we've got. Shall I hand back over to you?
Yeah, thanks, Tristram. Yeah, so just some of the conclusions that we've drawn from the data from the polls and the surveys. So students and graduates recognise the importance of showcasing their problem-solving skills and their learning agility to employers. Resilience and commercial awareness are also important to demonstrate, but it seems that students and graduates are less likely to highlight this within the recruitment process. And then student graduates as well, it looks like they want to focus on developing those skills which are less important to employers. So some of those are perhaps more role-based ones, such as negotiating and influencing and dealing with conflict. Great to see that educators and suppliers are in broad agreement with employers, with just that continuing focus on working together to improve student understanding of what skills are best to demonstrate and develop. And as Tristram said there, employers are using a wide range of different approaches to test candidate skills. And for the ISE members, so certainly some of those larger organisations, assessment centres and interviews are definitely the most common. And then to finish there, students and graduates are primarily requesting support with more face-to-face selection stages and perhaps not as aware of the need to be prepared for those increasingly virtual processes. So the fact that, a lot of employers have said that they're going to be continuing to do hybrid recruitment going forward, and that an element of virtual assessment centres are still here to stay. I just wanted to finish by just drawing attention to some of the work we do at SRS in terms of helping employers to assess for these types of skills in their candidates, and also helping universities to develop these skills in their students and graduates. And we do this through a number of workshops, practical exercises and assessment centres. And whether they're practice assessment centres or a real thing for an employer, we have our own digital assessment platform, assess.digital. And we use this to give very personalised, very detailed feedback around some of the key skills that we've been talking about. So things like resilience and learning agility and so on. I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that we are offering a 1 month free trial of our platform. So a bit of a plug there. I just wanted to make you all aware of that. And if you are interested in finding out more information and seeing a free demo, please use the link there on the screen. We'd love to follow up with you. But thank you very much. That is everything we wanted to cover at this stage. So happy to kind of open it out to questions now.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Helen and Tristram. Really informative information there. So I've got a number of questions through, so I'll get stuck straight into those. A couple of them I might merge because they cover the same ground. But let me just start off with Sarah's first of all. So Sarah asked, when you ask students how they're developing those skills, did you give them the option to answer through my studies, my course? And I guess expanding on that, do you think that's also an important source for people to develop these skills, whether students realise it or not sometimes?
Yeah, so I think that question, we broke it down into where they're getting, if they're getting support from the career service or potentially their tutors, their more direct program leaders. So for me, that option of working with their tutors and so on would be the one about developing them through their course. Hopefully that would be the one they've chosen for that. We probably could explore that further because I know that there's a lot of discussion around technical skills being focused on as part of degree programs and not enough focus in some cases on those soft skills, on the employability element. So it's potentially something we could explore further with them, definitely.
Anything you want to add to that, Tristram?
No. I mean, Helen wrote that question, and I think there's something in the report where we've looked at some of the other responses that people have given, but yeah, there's not a lot more detail than what we've presented on this.
Yeah,
sure. Cool. Okay. Jolina's asked a question, which is, how would you define learning agility?
Learning agility. So I'm quite passionate about this particular skill, actually. I've just written a webinar for students on this. And there were a lot of definitions out there, so I did do my homework on it. And for me, it was about the ability to learn something, de-learn it, and relearn. And I think that's encapsulated in quite a few famous quotes out there. So you talk about some professionals out there who've always done things the way they have, they've always used certain systems, certain processes, but they have to then move to something completely different to kind of reset themselves. So it's the ability to be able to do that and to do it smoothly and efficiently. That's kind of my understanding of learning agility, and that's certainly what we've been sharing with the students over the last few webinar sessions that we've done. And it is a tough one to teach. It's a tough one to develop. Some of the things that I've seen going on with universities and potentially employers as well is some of these interdisciplinary projects where they're used to doing things a certain way as part of their degree, but they then have to adopt a completely different approach as part of a project, as part of a wider university project, as part of working with students from other degree programs to try and shift their focus from doing things and approaching things in this way they always have. But yeah, it's a very interesting skill, and it's actually one that I wanted to put into the survey based upon student requests. So it didn't feature in the ISE skills in their surveys, but students really shouted about it to us, said that they wanted us to explore it in more detail. They wanted more support with it. So yeah, it came through loud and clear that students recognise that as being important and want to talk about it more.
And Katie,
I think it was actually.
Sorry,
I was just going to say, I thought it was a skill that I was not that keen to put in because I thought people wouldn't understand what it meant. But actually, I was completely wrong, as is often the case. And it seems like both employers and young people, knew about that and were thought it was important and were interested in prioritising it in many cases. So I think it's definitely one that we should ask about in future ISE surveys.
Katie's asked a question also about learning agility, and she asked actually the question was, how do employers define learning agility? So I guess within that, do you think there's a difference between how students might define it, how employers might define it, and how academic institutions might define it, of course, as well?
I mean, I don't think we really know, but I mean, I suppose some of these things, I mean, I actually had some of the same questions asked to me about resilience when I was talking to one of the employer groups yesterday, and these terms, they do include a lot of quite complex concepts in them, and it's very possible that different people interpret them in different ways. But from what we can see here, it does seem like people have got their head around the idea that there is a thing called learning agility, and that it is something which is valuable. And that, and as I think Helen's definition is a good one, and we can assume that people mean something like that. And without doing sort of more detailed work about what exactly concepts sit in people's minds, I think we have to sort of assume that people are, it's that ability to learn and unlearn, to move from one way of doing things to another, and also to see the importance of learning, I think is another part of it. But yeah, it seems like people have got some kind of relatively stable understanding of it. Yeah,
I'd agree with that.
I've got a couple of questions here on a similar theme from Edward and Olivia, who are asking about this disconnect between employers, educators, and students. Sort of asking, have we got more detail on why there is that disconnect? And then Olivia's expanded that in terms of, what are our thoughts on what career services can do to address that disconnect between employers and students in particular.
I don't think it's too much of a disconnect between educators and employers from what I can see. Broadly they were in agreement about what skills are important, and you can understand that the educators are focusing on the career management side of things as opposed to employers. So it's probably more the disconnect between students and employers that we're looking at. For me, it would be about going back to that point around do students realise the importance of soft skills enough in comparison to technical ones? Because negotiating and influencing and dealing with conflict and leadership, they are soft skills, I recognise that, but they are perhaps a little bit more leaning towards jobs and workplaces. And students are still very much focused, I feel, on talking about some of their achievements within their degree, some of the knowledge, some of the projects they've completed, some of the dissertation topics they've written about. And more work needs to be done to show that actually some of their soft skills that they do as part of being carers, as part of playing football, and just some of the things they demonstrate in extracurricular activities, that needs to be drawn out more. And I've seen some fantastic work from career services doing that within the universities to help students give greater weight to that, or at least equal weight alongside their technical achievements. But for me, that is the disconnect. So although I would say things have improved, students and graduates probably do still perceive their technical abilities as being more important to employers than some of their softer skills, which is why they want to develop those areas. What are your thoughts on that, Tristram?
Yeah, I mean, it's always difficult because you get these answers and you don't get the detail, and that's the problem with quantitative work like this. But one of the things that occurred to me was that students are imagining themselves in jobs which have more responsibility than they actually are likely to have at the early part of their career. So, you know, they emphasize leadership, negotiating, and influencing, these kinds of things, which are kind of like fairly high level skills that you probably don't expect someone who's hired this year to have. You know, something you build up over the beginning of your career, and once you've taken up management roles and so on, you start to exercise those things a bit more. Whereas the employers want people who are a bit more sort of solid and dependable, so the resilience, the learning agility that can pick up what they want and so on. So I did wonder whether it's not just about a misunderstanding exactly of skills, but it's actually a bit of a misunderstanding of what the nature of early career work is actually like, and whether students are kind of have a slightly inflated imagination about what the first years of work will look like in terms of their responsibility and so on. So, I mean, you know, we can't prove that, but if you look at the patterns, it sort of seemed to lead in that direction a little bit to me.
I've got a couple of questions from Susan and Catherine, actually, which again I think I'll link together because the themes are broadly similar. So I talked about, I should say actually, if everyone's looking, why am I looking to the side? It's because I've got a monitor and that's where the questions are. So I'm not staring distractedly out the window. Yeah, so a question, couple of questions, and they're around actually this piece around using applications forms and CVs, but also actually you both did talk about how the recruitment process is different for different bits of the labour market. You know, your typical ISE member does use an application tracking system and does use application forms, not CVs, etc. But I wonder if you've got any thinking around actually that other side of the job market, using LinkedIn and the hidden job market. Does what you're saying also apply equally to that? And then expanding on that, you know, is there any advice on actually getting out to students who are aware of those differences in the labour market and different approaches that they can use, rather than just sort of having too much generic, you know, blanket kind of advice, I guess?
Yeah, so you're talking about some of the SMEs using LinkedIn and, as I say, doing more written applications and so on. I mean, I have actually spoken to a lot of SMEs who are doing online interviews still, so not perhaps the bigger digital assessment centres, but there's still a bit of a hybrid approach there in doing some of those technical elements. So I would argue that students still need to be prepared for that, even for the smaller organisations. And I know that the data we've done doesn't necessarily represent those smaller ones. But that, yeah, it's still a case in point that, as I say, a lot of SMEs are still doing some of the online elements. I think the students have identified that and actually I've just done a webinar this morning where students do tend to get a bit fixated on cover letters and application forms. I had quite a few questions around that in the audience this morning. They do seem to get most worried about some of the paper elements more, alongside psychometric tests perhaps. So I think it's spending time with the student and graduate to understand what industry, what role they're applying for, and then the career service or suppliers educating them on what those methods are that they most commonly use, because yeah, there is going to be some difference in terms of which area they're going into. But I would argue that they really have, in this particular survey, they really have said that they want support more face-to-face than virtual, but I'd argue that across the board, you know, they still need to be prepared for virtual, even for those very, very small organisations.
I think one of the things that you can think about is why is there this difference? And a lot of the difference is driven by scale. And so ISE type employers are need things that can manage a much larger number of candidates than you do when you're an SME, of course. But it's also driven by, I think, a genuine critique of what's wrong with sort of cover letter CV type approach, which is both that it's more difficult to handle, but also that it overemphasizes your ability to build a narrative around your life. And so I think there are other there are other techniques which students need to be ready to do that. That's an important skill, and that's going to be an important skill even if you go through a more formal kind of recruitment system that's more automated. Your ability to sell your experience is going to be useful. So those skills are going to still be useful. I think what happens when you do cover letters and CVs is that becomes almost the most important thing. Whereas when you're doing a process that is more sort of skills and values and more kind of quantitative measurement based, which is what our members are using, then you've got some things to balance that off, and that's probably good recruitment practice. But it doesn't mean that the skills you learn when you're writing a CV or when you're developing a cover letter are useless to you if you go to an ISE member. You're still going to have to create that narrative. You're still going to have to tell your story in various different points.
Question here from Catherine. This is quite an interesting one, actually. I've probably got a view on this, but I'll save it till afterwards. So Catherine says, do you think that students are unaware that successfully completing a degree shows time management?
Ooh, that is an interesting question. I like that one. I would probably say no. I'm not sure they are aware that is good evidence. They do assume a lot of things that they do, like being a carer and some of the things they do outside of their degree. They don't see them as being important. They don't necessarily pull the skills from that. And I'm just thinking of when I've interviewed candidates, they don't tend to use their degree as a good example of time management. They'll use it as examples of research and group work. So I would probably say no to that.
Yeah, I mean, it is an important message, isn't it, that your degree is probably the most substantial bit of experience that you've got that you can actually work off of. And so candidates should recognise the value of that, and that often that might exceed the value of a part-time job that you've had for a relatively short period of time. But yeah, this is the kind of stuff that career services are engaged with helping people to figure out. So yeah.
Yeah, I probably have a slightly different view, which is why I thought it was an interesting question, which is that I think the challenge is when students rely on their degree for evidence is if they're going for a graduate job, everybody else has exactly the same the same experience by definition. I've often used to think when I used to be recruiting, when somebody used, example of group work in a university, I always thought it's just not a great example because pretty much every student does it as part of their degree. They're told to do it and often forced into groups. And this is slightly tongue-in-cheek, but I'm not sure actually completing your degree is good evidence of time management. It shows you finished it, but I wasn't very well organised when I did my degree. The amount of essay I was doing at 2 o'clock in the morning to get it done by the deadline. So, but I think it's a challenge, particularly for students who maybe don't have other experience. But it's I think it's being smart around who you use it, but the principle of actually knowing where you've got these skills and being able to evidence those to employers when it's. I still think there's a real problem, isn't there, with students who this concept of transferable skills is they just often don't realise the skills they've got, and they don't realise that employers actually don't expect them to be, they're hiring, new talent with potential, with limited work experience. So I still think there's that mismatch sometimes in thought processes. So got a couple more questions. So one from Ed, actually, another one from Ed. This is quite interesting. So he talks about tutors and lecturers. Often they're helping students with a recruitment process, etc. But he says that is there a challenge actually, where actually, of course, tutors and lecturers don't necessarily have direct experience of these processes. So is there a need to educate the educators? Edward asks.
I think that's a very valid point. Absolutely. I think, again, I've joined a few conferences recently, Universities UK and some of your own from the ISE, where there are people being brought in to bring together some of these program leaders and personal tutors to kind of discuss the concept of employability and the fact that people's definition of employability varies quite greatly, even within the same institution or even within one faculty. Program leaders might have very different definitions of what that means and what are transferable skills. So absolutely people need to be brought together to clarify what these things mean and what they're working towards. There are a couple of universities out there that have quite centralised skills framework, quite centralised definitions that are broadly applied to all modules, and all programme leaders have to show how their module outcomes fit with those. So yeah, I do think there is a piece around educating programme leaders and stuff on what that can look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think academics, well, I think it's useful for students to have, in fact, for all of us to have career conversations with as many people as we possibly can. Like we definitely should be encouraging people to talk about their career, to talk about what they want, to talk about how they're going to approach recruitment processes and so on. And academics are highly successful professionals who have succeeded through recruitment processes that are not wildly different from the ones that are used in any kind of recruitment. And actually, if they were, I'm very against this talk of, well, when you get into the real world, because universities are the real world, that the processes they use are not so different. And so I think actually academics have got a lot to offer, and really they should be encouraged and developed to be able to support students in that kind of way. Where I think you can't really expect academic and teaching staff in universities to have the knowledge required is on the detailed technical side of recruitment processes, where I think you can expect the careers service to know that. I mean, careers service should understand the different types of psychometrics that are out there. They should understand what kinds of online assessments are useful, what an automated interview is and how it works. They should be able to give students tools and advice about how to manage those. I don't think you can expect every member of staff to do that, but that's really about saying, yes, you should be having career conversations, yes, you should be supporting students, but you should also be referring to the relevant professionals when you get to the edge of your knowledge base. And I think that if we can get academics to do that, then you build a kind of career positive university environment, rather than just sort of saying, well, anything a student mentions, send them to the careers service, But I think there are places where it does require more technical knowledge. You can't expect everyone to have.
I mentioned an example from a while ago. One of your colleagues, actually, Tristram, an English professor at Leicester. I saw him present once, talking about how he'd been to witness, to actually, to see a graduate assessment centre actually as a visitor. And he said it was really interesting because it did change the perception of actually what he was talking about, teamwork around actually seeing how it was assessed. And it also, funnily enough, also made him think about actually how he was creating things like group exercises, and maybe thought, well, maybe actually I should be, rather than just taking a piece of academic work and just giving it a group, actually thinking about the nature of how that exercise is designed. So a couple more questions. I think we've got time just to cover these two off. One is a very quick one from Julia. She was asking, I don't think you've done this, but I'm interested to know if you can do it, which is actually looking at the results broken down perhaps by different mission groups, so Russell group, non-Russell group, to see if there's anything different to be learned in the data from that kind of analysis.
Yeah, we haven't done that this time, but that's not to say that we couldn't. But yeah, we'd have to get back to you on that level of detail.
Yeah, I mean, if we've got universities, we could potentially look at that. I mean, it would be interesting to do. When we did a survey last year where we were able to break it down by various kinds of class-based things. I'm trying to remember exactly what category we had. I think we had Russell group, non-Russell group, and it did make a difference on a few answers. It wasn't generally, it doesn't make a big difference, but there were a few areas where people were giving different kinds of answers depending on the type of university they went to. So yeah, we could look at that probably.
And one last question, which I think is a good one to end on, and it's around actually talking about the highly competitive nature of the graduate market. It's very competitive. I mean, it's always competitive, but particularly at the moment. So as an output of all this excellent work that you've done, are there any key bits of advice that stand out that we should be giving to graduates, to help them navigate the whole sort of application selection process and get that job?
I mean, for me, it would be to welcome as much interaction as possible with employers, to take advantage of any opportunity, whether that's in person or online, And I'd argue that there's a lot more content out there, a lot more opportunity for people to do that because of what employers have had to create in response to the pandemic. They do need to increase their understanding of what employers are looking for. So yes, get involved with the career fairs as you did before, perhaps, but also look at some of these short virtual internships, some of these online one-day workshops. Use these online platforms, these online communities more often. There's lots of employers have created these kind of employability hubs, hosting networking events. I think it was actually in an earlier ISE webinar where there was one law firm was doing these commercial cafe initiatives where they were getting students along to talk about just current topics and things. So that would be my top tip to students and graduates, and that's certainly something I'll be passing on is to maximise their exposure and interaction with the world of business with employers. I mean, they have as well, thinking about those hierarchy, those 5 top skills that we looked at, it is to make sure that they can demonstrate evidence of those 5 areas in particular, particularly problem solving and learning agility. So checking their understanding of it and making sure that they can give tangible examples for those key skills, whether that's showing that at different stages of the recruitment process. It could be examples in an interview, it could be writing some of it in a cover letter, but to make sure that they have covered off those key skills that most employers are looking for.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should be careful here, because what we're not saying here is that there's some kind of terrible crisis where students are completely clueless and employers are looking for something completely different from what they can give. I mean, there are definitely areas of overlap, and it is a matter of degree. But I think, if we were going to stand back from all this and say, what does it really tell us? I think it tells us that students are often working off of a kind of working concept of what employers are after and what work is like, that is not necessarily informed by genuine interactions with employers or research. It's a kind of what's sometimes called like a folk concept. You have this sort of folk theory about what things are probably like, and then you work off of that. And I think really the answer is that, exactly as Helen said, is that the answer for students is to spend more time informing themselves about the process and trying to get into the mindset of what employers are looking for, but also what the jobs that they're applying for actually are kind of, what's the composition of those jobs. And I think if you do that research work, you're going to be in a much better position, both in terms of if people ask you questions about that, which they might do in the recruitment, but also because you'll just be in the mindset of what they're looking to recruit for. So yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. It's probably what we would have told students anyways. Do your research, do your due diligence, and make sure that you know what you're getting yourself into.
That's great, fantastic, thanks for that. And of course, the question, if I had the proverbial pound for every time I got asked by a student, what's the one thing I can do? There is no one thing, is there? Which is what you both said, is it's a whole range of activities consistently that do make the difference. Helen, Tristram, really great session. Thanks very much. Lots of insights there. Great piece of research work, and also really good questions from the audience. We had 107 people on. At max. I see people starting to drop off just a little bit. Obviously, it's trying to grab a sandwich before the next Zoom call begins. And thanks again, Helen, for the support. It's great to partner with SRS. It's really good to have these relationships with supply partners like yourselves. As I said at the very start, this session has been recorded. You will get an email with a link to that recording. It'll also be in our newsletter Let's Week, so you can catch up on what you haven't seen, and also be able to share it amongst your colleagues. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Tristram. Thanks very much. Hopefully see you all again soon.
Bye-bye.